Let's jump in and talk about psychedelics. There's some great comments coming in here. I really appreciate this. Chris Fitzgibbon very honestly said, Brian, I'm on the bench, but changed my mind. Cool. I'm really glad you're here. And look, when I first started London Real, I had never really done a psychedelic. I had actually done some mushrooms in Amsterdam, haven't we all? And I had kind of a bad experience. I didn't know what to do. It was the wrong set and setting. I didn't understand what was happening. My ego was being destroyed, and I panicked, and I resisted it, and I fought it. And it ended up being kind of a bad experience for me, although I think it later had good implications. It was only that I learned about these medicines and substances, and I learned how to use them, that I could then channel them to heal my trauma. Since then, I think I've had 6 ayahuasca ceremonies, probably 6 or 7 psilocybin ceremonies, DMT maybe 3 times, and that's kind of been the extent of my psychonauts experiences, and I'll talk about that today. Nathan says, yes, I've tried psychedelics and they help me with trauma and addiction. Thank you, Nathan, I appreciate that. The 51 says you need good grounding on psychology on their own. He says no. Okay, good, I really appreciate that. Galaxian says, yes, it's magic mushroom season in the UK. I think it actually is, but you got to know where to get them and know the right ones to get, so be careful on that. Albino says, I'm going to try some from my depression and PTSD. Really good, because psychedelics are being used right now to treat PTSD and depression, and I want to talk about that with Rick Doblin. And Ellie says, I've been using drugs for 10 years of my life. I did 2 rehab programs, and the second worked for me. I had a psychedelic experience after my rehab, and it changed my mind. Interesting stuff, Ellie. I appreciate that. You know, a lot of people that have struggled from addiction and gone through the 12-step process look at these substances as drugs, and so they stay away from them. Although, in my opinion, a lot of those things can maybe help you with some of your trauma and addiction. I stopped drinking about 20 months ago, 21 months ago, but I have done ayahuasca because I think it's important to my healing, and I want to talk about that today. So appreciate those comments. If you're coming in late, tell me, can psychedelics cure trauma? Have you tried them? What is your trauma or your addiction that you'd like help with the psychedelics to help you get to the next level? And I want to start with talking about my good friend, Dr. Gabor Mate. And this is a picture of me and Gabor in studio talking at our last episode of London Real. And Gabor featured in our movie Iron Mind last year, which was my road to race my first Ironman race. I also went really deep into my past and my struggle with addiction and my heroin overdose in 2001. Yes, you heard that right. Brian Rose overdosed on heroin, I think once or twice in 2001. And it was great to talk to Gabor about that trauma and how to resolve that trauma and what plant medicines can do to help that trauma. Gabor asserted to me in that interview that trauma isn't what happens to you in the moment, it's what happens inside of you and whether you deal with that in an intelligent or productive way afterwards. So let me explain for that. In the movie Iron Mind, John Joseph was sexually abused as a child, but what happened was he could never process that. He could never talk to anyone about that. He could never confront what happened to people that did that to him, and so it stuck inside of him and it was allowed to fester and grow and turn into a trauma. So it's not what happens to you, it's actually what happens inside of you, which is why oftentimes psychedelics can find a way to unpackage that and get yourself to tell yourself a new story around that trauma. This was really powerful when Dr. Gabor Mate said this to me. He also said something else to me. I said, Dr. Mate, my trauma always started when I was 7 years old and when I was divorced. I said, my trauma isn't as bad as John Joseph's trauma. I wasn't sexually abused. And he said, stop it there, Brian. No one's trauma is worse than other people's trauma because it's how you process it. So one thing that might have happened to you when you were a kid, you might have been pushed around in school one day, and that might be something that gets you and stops you from doing so many things in your life. So always remember that you don't have trauma that is better or worse than anyone else, and it's important to realize that we all have that, and we all need to find a way to process it. And so I want to share with you this clip of Dr. Gabor Mate explaining that trauma isn't what happens to you, it really is what happens inside of you.
Trauma isn't what happens to you. It's what happens inside you. It's when you're alone with your pain and sadness, so you can't process it and move through it.
Is it possible to raise your children without trauma?
Life is inherently painful. You can't protect children from that, nor should you try to. What you can do, though, is help them experience it accompanied by a nurturing adult.
all addictive behavior can be traced back to childhood trauma. That's something you assert.
Not everybody who's traumatized becomes addicted, but everyone addicted was traumatized.
One of the things that's powerful that Dr. Gabor Mate says is he worked on the streets of Vancouver with some serious drug addicts, heroin addicts, crack addicts, all sorts of stuff. He really was in the trenches with people. Their lives were at the end, a lot of them. And he said, Brian, all addiction comes from trauma. He says, trauma doesn't create addiction, but all addiction starts in some type of trauma. So if you find yourself in an addictive state, and it doesn't have to mean heroin, it could mean alcohol, it could mean sex, it could mean retail therapy, it could mean a lot of things. A lot of times that is based in trauma. And it's important to maybe think about how you can go back and try to process that. And plant medicine might be a way, and it might not be, and it's not for everyone, and you definitely want to make sure that you're mentally stable enough before you go down these routes, but it's something to consider and something to educate yourself on, and that's really what I want to talk about today. So I hope that helped you, something worth thinking about. Some great comments coming in here. Dura from Instagram says, Brian, what do you think of psychedelics and yoga? I'm sure there's something interesting there with a microdose. For me, when I'm in a psychedelic episode, and by the way, I always go back to Terence McKenna, who is the now deceased kind of godfather of psychedelics, and his brother Dennis is a good friend of mine, and he features in our latest movie, Reconnect. I actually drank ayahuasca right next to him in Costa Rica. It was an epic and honor to do that with him, an epic experience. And Terence says, I believe in taking large doses of psychedelics infrequently. Large doses infrequently. So for him, it's going big in a controlled situation, which is a great one, which is at home, alone, in the dark. That's a great way to do it, not at a rock concert with 10,000 other people. And to go big doses so you learn a lot. And to do it infrequently. You don't need to do that once or twice a year. That's the way he recommended. I think he's right. So yoga and psychedelics, I don't know. When I'm in the psychedelic state, I can't be doing any yoga. I can barely see. So usually I need to be alone on my own or with a shaman or something like that. So, but microdosing, maybe there's something there. The Silver says shrooms, DMT, and acid help. That's really good. I appreciate that. Lewis Riches from Instagram says, have you tried microdosing? Does that help? I actually don't have much experience with microdosing. When I usually go in, I want to go in hard. I'm usually terrified to go in. I'm not looking forward to it. I've been avoiding it for a while, and I want to learn lessons, and usually it's very painful and emotional, as well as enlightening and inspiring. That's just usually how I do it. But I've heard something about microdosing. It sounds interesting. Galaxian says, to me, psychedelics show us that we don't die, which is reassuring. That's one way of looking at it. My guest, Carhart Harris, which I'm going to talk about shortly, disagrees with you. Reality Not Fiction says, I had PTSD but never did anything about it. Fascinated with DMT. I would love to try it. That's something you can look into. And Simteen says, any idea when the tickets for our movie are going to open? It should be very, very soon. All right. And again, you go to londonreal.tv/reconnect to find out more about that. At London Real, we believe that individual transformation can change the world. Join us and start your journey today.